Okay, well, welcome everyone. Welcome to virtual Thursday's Dire Literary Series. And tonight we have a very special guest who's written over 30 books, Michael Martone. Is it Martone, correct?
Martone, yeah.
All right. Let me tell you a little bit about Michael right now. And this is probably the first Wikipedia bio I've used, which is kind of cool. But it's a very good bio, so I accept that. Um, Michael was born in Fort Wayne, Indiana, as an American author. He has written nearly 30 books and chapbooks, professor at the program in creative writing at the University of Alabama, where he taught from 1996 until 2020. He's won 2 fellowships from the NEA, a grant from the Ingram Merrill Foundation. His stories and essays have appeared and been cited in the Pushcart Prize, the Best American Stories, the Best American Essays Anthology, and he has a new book, which is a memoir in flash called Table Talk and Second Thoughts. So thanks for being on the show, Michael. I'm going to turn it over to you.
All right. Well, I'll read from the new book, and it is made up of paragraphs, sort of anecdotes of people over the 40 years I taught, people I've met, and so it's a name-dropping book is what it is. So I'll read 4 of these. The first one is Trains, and it's set in Tuscaloosa in 2010. Adrienne Rich and I ended up talking about trains at dinner after her reading. She asked about the train trestle she'd seen crossing the Black Warrior River. I told her that the L&N and the GM&O and the Southern all had depots here. We talked about conductors and their watches and how time had been reinvented by the railroads. Not poetry, but not poetry. Train jargon, for those who know it, is a kind of poetry. I'll call you Train Man, she said, and did for the rest of the evening. And she left town knowing me as no one other. Did that come through okay? Okay. Cake, I-35, Iowa, 1983. Iowa State University lent me a car, I didn't have a car, to go to Des Moines Airport to pick up Czesław Miłosz and drive him back to Ames for a lecture and a reading. A Polish math professor went with us. On the trip there, we talked about the work in the fields. Miłosz had just won the Nobel Prize, and on the way back, I pointed out the harvested and turned fields on both sides of the highway. The dirt looks like chocolate cake, he said. The math professor in the back seat said that they were now going to speak in Polish, and they did all the rest of the way back to Ames. I understood nothing. Exacto, Syracuse, 1993. During the small talk at dinner that night, I wanted to ask Louise Gluck about the Exacto knife. Her father, I thought, had invented it for use as a scalpel, but it couldn't be cleaned. We had been talking about the white space between the print in a collage. I mentioned Frances Ponge, and she was how she was interested in everyday objects like soap and knives. Louise cut in right there and then. She said, wasn't a she, but a he. And right then, dessert arrived. And the last one, Spade, Cambridge, 1990. Everyone thinks Harvard University is rich, but it is cheap when it comes to telephones. My office at 34 Kirkland Street was next to Seamus Haney's, and we shared a party line that rang all the time. The calls were almost always for him from all over the world. I took messages, and when he returned, we would have lunch in his office to review them. We would also talk about gardens and how we missed having one in the city. When I left to take a new job in a city where I could have a garden, Seamus gave me a garden spade, a ribbon around its handle, which is, after all these years and many, many gardens, still there, hanging by a few threads. So there you go.
Thank you, Michael. That was the fastest 7 minutes disguised as 3 minutes.
I didn't know how long that was going to
Yeah.
last.
I love just
But
popping in.
hey,
I love popping in like it's like I Dream of Jeannie, like, like the
yeah,
second that it's done. So we've got you got some very very interesting background and things we can talk about. So this book was described as the most name droppy book that they've ever read. So I know that you befriended David Foster Wallace. Does he appear in this book at all?
he does. He appears with his friend, um, Jonathan Franzen. And I was teaching at Syracuse, and David also was there, actually recovering and writing Infinite Jest. And when the book came out and it became relatively bigly famous, he got a job teaching for the first time. And so we became sort of close because he had never taught before and I had been teaching. So, but when Jonathan Franzen came, Franzen said, well, you know, you're so happy up at Syracuse, maybe I should move out of New York. That was never going to happen. But, uh, um, and so I drove them around looking at houses. And the final house I showed them was Raymond Carver's house. Uh, Carver had been dead for a while, but the house is on the market and it was way overpriced because, oh, it was Raymond Carver's house. So I was standing there with the two of them looking at Raymond Carver's house in Syracuse. So that's the name dropping there.
Wow, that's amazing. There's like so much history that within your book. But like, tell me something that like you're at a cocktail party. So Foster Wallace, for example, everyone thinks they know him. Everyone's read Infinite Jest. They've seen documentaries. If you're at a cocktail party, is there anything that people wouldn't know? Like, hey, you know what?
Yeah, well, I mean that's why I read Rich's piece, and I was really conscious about having my interactions with these writers sort of not being about writing, but about being, you know, sort of adjacent to it. And so, who knew that I didn't know that Rich was really into trains, and you know, it wasn't an insight really into, you know, being on point as far as being a writer and an artist, because I thought other people could do that. But sort of, I was just interested in the kind of everyday grunt work, you know, I mean, just living in the late 20th century America as a writer. And also, I'm of the age where the curious thing happened in the history of writing in America, and that is the explosion of MFA programs and the move of writers into the universities as a discipline. And now that I'm out of it, 40 years, I can see a real archway of, you know, that experiment. Purdue University's MFA, other MFAs are closing down, applications are down, because now I think writers are saying, why should I go to a university and teach freshmen for no money when I might as well go into advertising or into technical writing? And so we're sort of back as writers as a group to doing the things we did before 1980 in the explosion of universities. And as we were talking before, universities aren't particularly happy about having writers now. You know, it's STEM and it's who could bring in grant money and that kind of thing. The humanities sort of washing up.
So speaking of writers and humanities, your wife Teresa is a poet.
Yeah,
Your children Sam and Nicholas are both writers. So I mean, I've interviewed people that
yeah.
have
They all
been
went into the company business.
I mean, I've interviewed people that have had spouses or partners that are writers, but never with children. So let me ask you a question because I know that you love them all and love all of their writing equally. Who is the best reader of them all? In other words, critical reader. Like if you were to choose one person in your family to be like, okay, I need this, I need to nail this by tomorrow. Who would you bring it to?
Well, Teresa, for no doubt, we go all the way back. We met in graduate school at Hopkins, and so it's always been, you know, it's always been Teresa. the interesting thing about the kids, having writers in the family, for one thing, I think it made it not weird for them. I mean, it was like, this is what adults do. They write. But both of them sort of found their own lanes. Sam writes much more fantastically in comic books. He's a big fan, video games. And Nick is an actor and director, and so writes plays. And those are things that both Teresa and I don't usually do. So we all have our own sort of territory in there. But Sam is, back to what I was saying before, Sam is an interesting case in that he did get his MFA at Arizona State, but he never believed that that MFA, I don't think, was going to lead him to a job in the university. It was beginning to contract already. So what he is now is a technical writer for Squarespace. And so what he does is he does that technical writing, and then, he has a group. He lives in Brooklyn. He has a group of friends, and they go to the bar and do workshops, which I think is what, they did in Paris all those years ago. So that kind of thing.
I read in your bio that you are you have an affinity toward false biographies. So define false biographies.
Well, okay. The one book I have is called Michael Martone. And Michael Martone is made up of 100 and some, and I still write them, contributors' notes. And so as writers, you know what contributors' notes are. You do publish in a magazine or someplace, and they say, send a contributor's note. And it's always interesting that we automatically switch to third person, and there's a sort of form for it. And it's a piece of writing that we all know and that editors expect that you are doing. And so a while ago, I started just using the form, but starting to variate things, change the biography, and also include the biography. Each one of the contributors' notes begins with Michael Martone was born in Fort Wayne, Indiana, but then it takes tangents. It goes in different ways. And that was way before the current idea of parallel universes and all of that, but it was an interesting experiment to do. And what was really interesting was that I would send these contributors notes, all titled contributors notes, to an editor. And the editor would say, oh, okay, we'll publish. I see that these are stories because they're contradictory. So we'll publish a couple of them. Can you, and if he said, yeah, I'd ask him if he could publish them, not in the front of the book, but in the back of the book, in the contributors notes section. That being that, of course, all of you who are writers know that when you get a copy of something that you've contributed to, first thing you do is go to the contributors note and see who else is in the magazine. So I thought I just will put the story back there. And some editors did that. They just put my contribution to the magazine in the contributors note. But others would say, no, we're going to put it in the front of the book, send a contributors note. So I'd send another contributors note, and they'd say, no, send a real contributors note. And I said, these are real contributors notes. So that's one example of fake biography or false biography. As a teacher, one thing I did in graduate school, I taught a forms class that was in the construction of authorship. So we read, my student writers read books like Martin Eden, Movable Feast, Alice B. Toklas, On the Road, Minor Characters. We read books that had authors as characters. Some were memoirs, but others, of course, were marketed as fictions. And, I think those students, we think, oh, we're going to go there and learn how to write. And of course, the students were coming to universities to learn how to be an author in America that had no sort of model. And so we could look at France, Paris, or we could look at the Lower East Side of New York and see what these people were thinking, writers, how they should behave or why they should behave that way. So
You
that was always interesting too, that the creation of yourself as a writer is in a way always a fiction, right? It's a construction, it's a fabrication.
So you like to do a lot of things. You like to blur the lines between forms and be very playful. I know that within genres, it's always helpful that a writer can be playful. But your membership from the American Academy of Poets was revoked in 1988 because you wrote two books that basically they were the same book, but one had line breaks. And it was called Poetry, and I guess the American Academy of Poets did not like that. Did that get you upset? Did you fight that at all?
Well, this is going to be a complicated answer, Timothy. In fact, I have kind of a newish book that is just coming out next week, and it's called An Interview with Michael Martone by Matthew Baker. And Matthew Baker and I met 20 years ago at Hope College in Michigan, where he was an undergraduate, and he, as when I'd visit places, they'd send undergraduates to do an interview like this. And I said to Matthew back then, you know, these interviews always turn out to be the same thing. Maybe we could try something different. We ended up not doing something different in the form of the interview. But then years later, he called me and said, I have an idea. I want to do 9 interviews of Michael Martone, but I'm not going to talk to you. Is it okay if I just use you as a character in these interviews? And one of them was an actually true interview, but 8 of them were using some of my biography, but also he made up some things. Now, what's really interesting in the time he published all of them as interviews with Michael Martone. But what's really interesting is what you just read was from one of the fake interviews of Michael Martone that Wikipedia, someone else, I don't put things in Wikipedia, someone else put into my Wikipedia page. And so, you know, how Wikipedia maintains itself, of course, is by editors who are constantly doing that. But what Matthew Baker did was flood the zone with information that, in some ways, like your question, it was about a formal question that I'm really interested in, but the specifics of it are not real.
So the made up parts of the interview end up on Wikipedia as facts.
Yes.
Wow.
Yeah.
I kind of love that. Now, at some point, do you think AI is just going to start just doing that?
Well, maybe we are already there. I mean, part of the reason, another book that I have is Blue Guide to Indiana, which is a fake travel book. And part of the reason I wanted to do a fake travel book of Indiana is no one travels to Indiana, so I could make up things. But also, working in a bookstore, I knew that if the fiction shelves get cold a lot faster than the travel book. So if I get the travel book into a bookstore, it would stay there longer on the shelves, or so I thought. And yeah, and I got a cease and desist order from the real Blue Guides saying this isn't a Blue Guide. So they were protecting their trademark. But so already, you know, we live in this world of fabrication and fakes that always was sort of interesting to me, but in a humorous way to make you laugh, as opposed to what we're seeing now more and more as a very dangerous way of attacking our sense of what is a reality or truth.
Again, go ahead.
Well, I like to think that what I was doing was trying to put any reader on their toes, because, oh, here's the frame of a book that's called a novel. And so, well, maybe other things are being fed to you, even though you think you're in a kind of safe space as a novel. So,
Also with blurred lines, a lot of fiction people are afraid to reveal facts. It's very true and it becomes fiction, but there's also a genre called creative nonfiction. As a
yeah.
writer, which would you prefer to write?
Well, I mean, let me answer it this way. One of the curious things I think about the group of us going into universities, what is truly strange about that is the university is an ancient scientific sorting machine. I worked in a program, in a department, in a college, in a university, and here was fiction and here was fact, and there were all these categories. And I truly believe, and that's why I think flash fiction and prose poetry shows up so much, that our job as writers is not so much to pick a genre and then meet its ingredients, but instead write something and allow the critics to figure out what it's doing. And it was really weird, I think, for all of us to go into the university and then all of a sudden have to defend those boundaries of genre. I mean, I was all for like, if I'm going to work here, I'm going to mess it up as much as I can because, that's the way I think we think. But, I had colleagues who were all about, colleagues at the University of Alabama. When it came to reading applications, you had to identify yourself as a poet or a prose writer. And why wasn't I able to read the poetry applications and the poets didn't want to read the prose applications? So I'm not a specialist, I'm a generalist. So
A question from Robert in the chat. So in high school, he says every time he cursed, he had to put $1 in a curse jar. Is there a jar somewhere that if you drop a name, you have to pay something?
no, not that I know of. I mean, the first book I wrote, or I should go back, I really loved Edith Hamilton's book, Mythology. Do you know that book?
I've not read it now.
Now, in 1963, it was like one of the first books in the United States that was talking about the Greek myths and the Roman myths, and it really made familiar Hermes and Zeus and all of that. And it was read in high school for a long time. This was your introduction to Greek mythology, Roman mythology. And it turned out that Edith Hamilton grew up in Fort Wayne, Indiana. I used to play in Hamilton Park. And what mythology is, I think when it comes to sort of narrative, is it's a narrative that a people share. Everyone knows in Greece, everyone knew the story of Oedipus, but you still read, Sophocles' take on that. And so when I started to think about what I'm going to write about, I immediately went to name dropping. What's the mythology of Indiana? And so I had a story about James Dean, a story about John Dillinger, just pre-packaged. And in a way, it was really easy because those were pre-packaged characters. I didn't have to create characters that way.
Jim Neighbors didn't make the cut.
Neighbors didn't make the cut, but Colonel Sanders did.
Nice.
Colonel
Awesome.
Colonel Sanders is from Indiana, actually, so he was in there.
All right, last question. We had brief discussions about how education is being attacked politically now, and also how maybe MFA programs, with what's going on with them, the trend is they're not as valuable. If you're in charge of a big fix to make education important and valuable at the same time, what would you do?
Well, I mean, what I came to be doing until the Eye of Mordor, which was the dean, finally, found me, was that, especially with undergraduates, these were not graduate students who'd already decided that they were going to be artists and writers. but people who were just beginning to think about that. What I taught was, the Russian idea of defamiliarization. And the nice thing about teaching in Alabama is that I could take the students outside of the classroom and, I mean, you see those pictures, right, of teachers sitting on the lawn teaching. I mean, I was sort of one of those teachers, but I was not teaching anything. I was just stopping people and saying, have you ever noticed that? Have you ever noticed this? You've walked back and forth on this street, all the time. What's this thing right here? It was the, especially students toward the end, they were so in debt. They were so concentrating on getting a job, and they couldn't have any sort of distractions. I mean, if I had my choice, and I tried, it was to say that the distractions are a good thing. And even if you're distracted, you can actually look at the thing that you're not thinking about who you are and what you're doing.
All right. Well, it was a pleasure to talk with you and to hear you. Here is the book. Oops. Table Talk and Second Thoughts, a memoir in flashes by Michael Martone. And also, as you know, buy from any bookstore that you would like. Doesn't have to be the one I just brought up. And you can find Michael's other books and his new one that's coming out next week. So check it out. Michael, thank you so much for being
Thank
here.
you so much, Timothy. Thank you, everybody.
And anyone watching on the stream that wants to log into the Zoom and be part of the open mic, feel free to use the link. And thank you for watching out there. And I forget how to turn off. There it is.